Hello, BookTube. As you know, I'm doing a read-along in honor of Nonfiction November. I'm doing a read-along in the month of November with Jordan Parsons of the BookTube channel by the same name. I'll leave a link to his channel down below. We decided for Nonfiction November that we would do a sort of leisurely read through a work of nonfiction that is rather pointedly connected to Jordan's own life. We decided that we would read Robert Sullivan's book Rats. There is the island of Manhattan, but shaped like a rat, because the bulk of the book takes place in New York City. We thought that we would read Rats just 5 or 6 chapters at a time, and just slowly enjoy it and talk about that. And I was talking with Jordan. We were doing a little bit of Voxering, shirtless Skyping. I said, all right, well, I'll read it on my tablet. And he said, no. I said, well, what do you mean? I thought we agreed we were going to do a read-along with this book. He said, I know, but you can't read it on your tablet. You have to read it on your Kindle. Like me. Because he's reading it on his Kindle. So I thought, oh, well, okay. It's a little bit doctrinaire on your part, but all right, I'll read it. I'll call it up on the old Kindle Oasis. He said, no. No. I said, what do you mean? You just said I have to read it on my Kindle. He said, not on your Kindle Oasis. Has to be your Kindle Paperwhite. Like me. Okay, so I called it up on my Kindle Paperwhite, and that's what we're reading on here. And we're doing the first 5 chapters of this book, in which Sullivan decides to investigate rats in New York City. Wild, live rats in New York City. So not so-called fancy rats, not the kind of rat that you would get for a domesticated pet, for instance, but instead the 2 different types of rats that tend to live in profuse numbers in Manhattan. Although right from the beginning, Sullivan is dispelling myths. One of the myths that he wants to dispel involves profuse numbers. You go to Manhattan today. You talk to somebody who lives in Manhattan today. I have 4 friends who live in Manhattan. I have 2 friends who live in the outer boroughs, and they'll all say the same thing immediately when the subject of rats comes up. You talk to a New York City realtor, someone who shows apartments and condos for a living, they will say the same thing. Instantly they will say it. And that is 1 rat per person. They just say that off the top of their head without even thinking about it. And Sullivan points out that that's not even close to true. There are far fewer than 1 rat per person in Manhattan. That's just ridiculous. He also dispels a myth that that rats need to keep chewing and gnawing on things, and that if they don't, their incisors will grow right up through their heads. He says they wear down naturally on their own. Rats like to do it. That's all. It's healthy for them to do it. And they have apparently some sort of skin flap that comes down to prevent the shavings of what they're gnawing on from actually going into their system, to prevent them from ingesting those things. Every time I read that, I've read that detail like a few times in a few different books. Every time I do, it always freshly amazes me, because you see that and you just automatically think the rat is eating the copper sheathing or the metal that it's gnawing on. But it's not. It's not eating. It eats just like you and me do. It's not a horta. But another one of the myths that that Sullivan dispels here is a little bit more pernicious. They're involving rat behavior. He stakes out a particular alleyway that turns out to be replete with rat life, and that he stakes out that alleyway, and that becomes sort of the locus of a lot of the action of his narrative in the first 5 chapters, so that he can talk about these things as a naturalist in the field. And it's the point about rat behavior connects with 2 points that Jordan makes in his video. I'll leave a link to his video about these first 5 chapters. One point that he makes is to remember that the rats you're seeing in Manhattan, living 500 to an alley on scraps from a food truck, are living in an extremely stressful environment. A violent, loud, stressful environment. It's not normal. And it does to their behavior exactly what it used to do. Manhattan is now basically a steel and glass playground for the ultra-rich. Normal people scarcely live there anymore, but I lived there for a time when normal people could live there. When you could have an apartment in Alphabet City, working in a retail job as a bookseller. You could have an apartment that gave you, if you went to your bathroom, to take a shower, you could look out the little window in the shower stall and see the Empire State Building. That is absolutely impossible now. But once upon a time, it was possible. And in those days when normal people filled the streets of Manhattan, filled the sidewalks, they acted weird, right? And that's not wrong. All the travel memoirs you've read where people go to Manhattan from sane parts of the country and think, geez, these people are really weird. They're all wound up. They're incredibly rude. They're incredibly forceful and whatnot. Well, that's the same thing. That's humans under a huge amount of pressure, some of it explicit, some of it implicit, acting in ways they wouldn't act if they were in Sheboygan. The same thing is true of the rats that Sullivan observes. And that's the point. One of the points that Jordan wanted to make is that these aren't normal. This isn't normal. This isn't a normal setting for these animals. So don't judge them on that account. Don't judge them on that account. And just the sheer amount of scene setting that the author does in these first 5 chapters is incredible. This is a perfect example of natural history done right, where the author takes a very familiar animal, an animal that you think you know well, and shows you how much you don't know them. Unfortunately, in these first 5 chapters, and I remember for the rest of the book, Jordan's second major point is also true, and you're going to want to know that point going into this book, which is that this is largely a book about killing rats. The author doesn't really want to do that. The author really wants to study them. And like anyone else who has ever spent any time around rats, even wild rats, you start to kind of like them. It takes a lot. If they attack you, maybe, but if they don't, you start to kind of like them. You start to kind of immediately spot different personalities. I myself have had a friend who had pet rats, which again is not the kind of animal that we're talking about here, but still close enough. And I had a friend who had pet rats, and it didn't work well at all when I brought my beagles over. When I went over without my dogs, I got to know those rats, including having the amazing experience once they got comfortable with me. I was reading on the couch. I had the amazing experience of one of them coming right up here, curling up right on, your clavicle, just like the tiny little thing with a silky soft fur, and just going to sleep. Just going to sleep right there. Just I want to be near you. I want to be pressing against you. I'm just going to go to sleep right here. It was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And that element of sympathy is going to make some of the things in these first 5 chapters hard to read. The comparison I would draw would be prior to 1950, 1960, thereabouts. Prior to 1950 or 1960, if you went to the bookstore and you were looking for a book on wolves, for instance, or especially on whales, any book that you would find would be all about the record of humans killing those animals. That's all that it would be about. There might be a little natural history thrown in here and there, but the main bulk of the book would be just an orgy of death, of these animals dying over and over and over again in the hands of man. Unfortunately, you're going to get a little bit of that in this book. No way around it. But boy, oh boy, rereading these 5 chapters, I really think you're going to enjoy it. I really do. This is a terrific introduction to a very misunderstood species that, even though it's living under enormous societal and environmental pressure, is still fascinating. And they're not just purely vicious. There's one character, one exterminator type in this book that says that when you encounter a big colony of rats, the thing that you really want to do is not wade in with boots and spades and poison and whatnot, but rather to locate and cut off their food supply. Because when you do that, they're going to start eating each other. That's rather brutal. And I kept thinking the whole time here, it's going to come up later in the book as well, but I kept thinking the whole time here when they were talking about preventative measures, does poison work? What does work and what doesn't work in getting rid of rats? Of course, I was thinking the whole time of herself. I live with a dog for the first time in my life. I live with a dog whose breed was entirely constructed to hunt and kill rats and mice, and history is full of anecdotal records that I 100% believe. I didn't believe them before I saw the speed that she has when she goes into that mode. She's not aware of what's happening. I'm perfectly convinced that her upper cognition is not aware of what's happening. It just happens instinctively. Now that I know the speed of it, I believe the anecdotes from England, for instance, that talk about how one miniature schnauzer could kill 100 rats in an hour, something like that, just one after another, after another, after another, after another, without any trouble at all. I might not have believed those anecdotes until I saw what Frida did to the mice who live in this apartment, or used to live in this apartment. Hi, baby. You're so cute. You are. They're all gone. Those mice are all gone. There are no mice that live here anymore, thanks to the bean. And I can't help but think that the same thing would have been true with rats. There's a really telling point in the chapters that we're reading today, where one rat specialist just puts out an open plea that the author echoes to all of those, I guess, well-meaning Manhattan residents who think, well, if I've got rats in the basement, I'll just get a cat. I'll just get a cat and put it down in the basement. The guy who's being interviewed in this part of the book says that he'd go down into the cellar and find the picked bones of the cat, because rats, city rats, are nothing to fool around with. They're big and they're strong and they're smart, and there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that when pressured in a corner, they will act in unison. I don't think that would have any effect on Frida. I really don't. But you never know. I wouldn't do it anyway. It's been forever since I lived in Manhattan, and when I did, I didn't have rat problems. And I thankfully, I didn't have cockroach problems either. There's nothing worse than cockroach problems. I did have mice. At the time, I was living with a stray dog who was very old and wasn't going to chase anything anyway. So I got to know the mice. I don't care if I have mice as roommates. I've only a couple of times, and only in Ireland, had rats in the place where I lived, and they never struck me as being particularly intrusive. Maybe that was because I had a lot of dogs, so they wouldn't come anywhere near where I was. But anyway, that is the first part of our read-along of rats. We're going to move on in this rat exploration next week, where I hope I will have my video up on the weekend, like all right-thinking people should. So until then, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.